Welcome to the 3 o'clock session at AltConf on Wednesday. Next up, we have Jacob Eiting, who's going to tell us about subscriptions and how hard they are. Take it away.
All right. Hello? You guys hear me? Subscriptions, yeah, woo, all right. So yeah, I'm Jacob. Why am I qualified to talk about this? Because I've suffered it a lot, basically. In the past, I started my career on the iOS SDK team, QA team, back in 2009. Did that for a little while, and then my biggest stretch of my career was at a company called Elevate. We were a brain training app, pretty early to do iOS subscriptions. We ended up getting App of the Year in 2014, which drove a ton of traffic to us, and we learned a ton about how to build a big business on in-app subscriptions, all the things that you need and want to do as you scale past $1, $2 million, $3 million in revenue, annual revenue. And then in the past 2 years, I took those learnings from Elevate and actually launched them into a service that helps provide these capabilities to smaller apps, and further deepened my love and hatred for StoreKit there. So this talk today, I'm going to start a little bit about StoreKit itself, like on the device, sort of like a brief history of StoreKit and then how it actually works. Talk a little bit about receipt validation and sort of the receipt file. And then I'm probably going to spend the bulk of the time talking about what it takes to build a subscription validation and tracking server, which actually tends to be the lion's share of the work if you're trying to build a subscription infrastructure for an app. Most of us are probably app developers, we're not backend developers, so that part can tend to be kind of a pain. But there are some tricks and orders of operations that I want to explain for what to build when, and so you don't back yourself into a corner. Let's take a brief trip in the time machine back to 2009 when I had fewer wrinkles and fewer gray hairs in my beard. When Apple introduced StoreKit in iOS 3. So iOS 2 was the first version with apps. iOS 3 was the first time you could sell stuff inside your app and not just as a paid application. Initially, it only supported consumables and one-time purchases, so subscriptions weren't part of the picture yet. But the API design choices that were made for iOS 3 we're still living with. And I think that's actually part of the reason that subscriptions are kind of awkward on iOS, is that we're still living with a lot of that legacy. Fast forward a couple of years, Apple did a big announcement. They did a partnership with News Corp and launched a iOS news magazine for the iPad called The Daily. If anybody's probably not a subscriber anymore, because I don't think it lasted more than a couple years. But this was their first, look, we can do subscriptions now on the iPhone and the iPad, and you can do, subscriptions to get content. And it was mostly targeted at content apps. So they were really focusing on, they had the newsstand product at the time, was really big, and they were saying, this is a capability, but only for content, periodical content. But not long after, Apple started to realize, software gets sold as a SaaS product, as a service, and they started opening up who was allowed to do subscriptions, up to the point now, today, where basically as long as you have recurring content, I forget what the exact language is, but basically as long as you're updating your app and adding new stuff with some frequency, Apple's totally fine with you doing subscriptions. They realize that developers make a lot more money, they make a lot more money, everybody wins, and so that's why almost every top grossing app is a subscription app if you're not a game at this point. So I'm going to dive into a little bit about StoreKit itself, which is a bit wonky, but I think it's worth discussing. The core of StoreKit is this class called the SK payment queue. And it's this monolithic singleton that is going to be your interaction point for doing anything with in-app purchase. And so the basic flow is you get this SK payment queue. It's going to be a shared SK payment queue. You're going to grab an SK payment product, and I'm not going to go into how you actually do this stuff. Actually, the Apple documentation on this and WWDC talks are pretty thorough on how this works, so I suggest checking that stuff out. First you add that product, that payment to the queue. You're going to have this SK payment transaction observer, which is essentially like a delegate You can have multiple of them is the difference why it's an observer and not a delegate. That will get notified. So as soon as you add this payment, the payment queue is going to tell your observer class, like, hey, I'm starting a transaction. I've transitioned this transaction into purchasing. Meanwhile, stuff happens as the payment queue talks to StoreKit D, which talks to the Apple servers. They charge the user's credit card or not, and then they write onto disk this monolithic receipt file, which we're going to go into more later. But that's the next step. They actually write a blob onto disk, which I think is an awkward way to interact with an API, but that's how it works. They write a file. After the file's been written, I kind of missed an arrow here, but you'll get notified again to the observer, like, hey, like a transaction finished, check the receipt file, which is like, why don't you just tell me what's in the receipt file instead of making me go check, but whatever. And then your observer's going to read that receipt file, determine if it worked, and then go back to the payment queue and say, like, okay, I'm done with this transaction. You can forget about it. I've granted the entitlements. I've unlocked the content. Okay, that's StoreKit 1.0. There's a simplifying aspect of this, is that step one prior to subscriptions was pretty much always happened based on like user input. So somebody would say, like, browse your store, look at your page, click, I'm going to buy. It was pretty easy to lock down the UI and sort of handle this loose interaction between StoreKit and your observer. But when we switch to subscriptions, basically the only thing that changed, the biggest thing that changed is that now these transactions, rather than happening because you called add, can just happen. And they happen if you renew, typically, but they can happen when your app is offline. It can happen when so you open the app, suddenly a transaction appears. You need to then consider, like, well, what happens if a transaction shows up on the queue and I'm not logged in, for instance, or I'm logged in as a different user. There's like lots of edge cases that this creates, and that's part, I think, the complexity of dealing with subscriptions on iOS, is that you have to really think about like the mismatch between your app state and StoreKit state. And yeah, they don't necessarily make it easy. A brief aside about one of my gripes with StoreKit is that they don't give you a way to know inside these transaction observers which payment actually triggered them. So I throw a payment on the queue. From my transaction observer, I don't actually know which payment triggered which observer call. So I can't know like exactly if I should like dismiss the UI or something, because I don't know. It could be a renewal transaction from a long time ago. This happens a lot in Sandbox when you've got a lot of crappy transactions that maybe you didn't cancel. They'll just show up on your queue, and like suddenly your thing will dismiss, and QA will send you a bug because their account's in a weird state. There really, really, really needs to be, and I'm gonna have to replay my thing. There really needs to be, like, when you add a payment to the queue, they need to give you an ID and then use that ID later. So I don't know if anybody in this room can help me with that, but I have a blog post about it, and there's a radar. So that's going to be a theme for this talk, is things I find wrong, and then the radar that goes with them. Okay, so the receipt file. So this is kind of cool. It's, if nothing, an academic exercise, but the receipt file is where kind of all the interesting information is. It's this file that StoreKit writes to the application container, so it's actually in a space that your app can read. And it can be used to verify the purchases actually happened. And what's really interesting, it can be used just with cryptography tools to verify purchases without communicating with Apple, which is neat, although somewhat useless. And it really contains all the interesting information that you're going to need for running a subscription business, basically the entire transaction history for a user, which is really cool. It's nice. If you have this receipt file for a user, you can see their entire transaction history. And so if you have all of the receipt files for all your users, you're able to see the entire, you have full visibility on your transaction history for your business. It's really important for computing business metrics like churn and active subscribers. So receipt validation. So the first thing you need to do when you get this receipt is you kind of want to check its validity, because there are StoreKit crackers out there that will just write garbage receipts that are fake. And you want to kind of make sure those are real. So there's two ways to do this. There's on-device receipt validation. I'm going to go through real quick. And then there's server-side receipt validation. So on device is where you're actually doing it on the phone, and then server side is where you're sending that receipt off to a third party, typically your server, to validate it. So on device receipt validation, and I just did a deep dive on this stuff, and I think it's really neat, so I'm going to share it. So the receipt file is this PCKS number 7 container, which I had no idea what that was until I read Apple's docs and did all the research. But it's basically a container format that has 3 things. It has a payload, which can be arbitrary data. It has a signature that's been signed by, in this case, Apple's private keys that they only have access to. And then the public keys equivalent to those and the certificates you need to bootstrap authority so that you can validate that the contents in that payload match the signature and that the signature could only come from Apple. And that's how you're able to tell just from this receipt file that it's legit. Some of the issues, though, is it includes some but not all of the useful information. In recent iterations of StoreKit, they've stopped putting some of the more interesting data in there, like offers, I don't think write to this receipt file anymore. But anyway, if you want to check this out, I also have a blog post on this, dissecting an App Store receipt. I go into like what's actually in there and like how you can actually pick it apart. So it wouldn't be a good talk without at least some code. So this is like a brief, really crappy implementation of how you would do on-device receipt validation, and basically like how would you check a subscriber status just using the device. The first thing you're going to do is like pull the receipt file URL. So it's just a URL. It's in your bundle. You're going to load that data. It's just a blob of data, so you can load it. This is bad Swift, so don't at me. I like early returns, okay? And then you're going to pass that data to a verify receipt function, which I'll talk about. And then it's going to be able to verify and actually parse out the contents of that receipt. In there, you'll find all your transactions. They'll have an expiration date. Typically, you just want to find the max expiration date. Return that, compare that against the system clock, and then you can unlock Pro. But you say, oh, Jacob, but what if the user changes their system clock? Well, they can do that, and then what are you going to do? And then after that, you would unlock Pro. So what actually goes on in that verify receipt data function? Well, cryptography. There's actually not a good reference implementation in Swift. Apple has a C implementation because it relies on OpenSSL, and they actually want you to link in your own version of OpenSSL. Don't do any of this. This is not worth it. It's great. It's an interesting curiosity, but this is not anything anybody should be doing. But yeah, check out my blog post if you're interested in that stuff. This is something not actually specific to on-device receipt validation, but it is important for anybody trying to read the receipt. So sometimes the receipt's not there, which is great. And that can happen typically when an app is side-loaded. So if it comes from Xcode, like if you're just install the app from Xcode, Xcode's not going to stick a receipt file in your container for you. There might be other cases where you load it from iTunes, but I don't even know if you can do that anymore. But anyway, so if your app isn't downloaded from an app store, or maybe from TestFlight 2, there are cases where there won't be a receipt. If you make an in-app purchase, that receipt will get updated, and there will be one. But if you haven't, it can just not be there. And there are cases where it can also be empty, which I don't actually handle in this code example, so sorry. But what you're going to want to do is if you can't load that data, you're going to have to trigger a receipt refresh request. It's just an annoying thing you have to handle. You're going to hit Apple, tell them, hey, I want to refresh this receipt. They have this lovely delegate API that you can call, and that'll come back, and then you should have a receipt after that's done. Not always the case, and it's still, even if it doesn't load the receipt, it will call requested finish regardless of if it succeeded or not, which is great. I should have a radar for that too. But I do want to throw out a warning about this, and you guys, anybody here who's done like sandbox testing of in-app purchases has definitely seen this before. It's actually gotten better since iOS 12 when they added the sandbox accounts, but you still see it occasionally. And this is what you'll see if you call a receipt refresh request and there's no iTunes account logged in, or in this case, there's no sandbox account logged in. And this was my life for 4 years. I tested Elevate on my phone once, and it just ruined it forever. Fortunately, this has more or less been fixed, but but the point is that you need to be careful about the SK receipt refresh requests. In practice, almost always, users have a receipt because they download their apps from the App Store. Very few people are loading their apps from iTunes. That would be a case where this might happen, or perhaps they I have to test this, but maybe if they restore from an iCloud backup, that might not be there. I'm not sure. But you will see this, but just know, in production, it actually doesn't happen all that often. Okay, I'm going to take a drink of water, and then we're going to move on to the next section. Thank you. All right. Next thing I want to talk about, this is where it gets exciting, is server-side receipt validation. So this is what most people should be doing. And how does that work? Well, your app, rather than trying to parse the receipt file on the device, you're going to send that receipt file off to your server, where your server could technically do the cryptography there too, but don't do that. You're going to call this verify receipt endpoint, which is kindly hosted by the iTunes team. You're going to send that receipt file off. Apple's going to tell you whether or not, my good friend Eddie is going to let you know. He handwrites every JSON response still. He's going to send that back, and it's going to say, it's going to have not only the contents of that receipt, the particular receipt you sent, but if there's a subscription in there, it's going to give you all the updated transactions. And that's sort of the magic that makes this work, is you can send that receipt and get the latest data. And that's going to be the core of writing a receipt, or an iOS subscription server is going to be calling to that verify receipt function and parsing the result. So when do you use which? Well, server-side receipt validation you should almost always use. If you're planning to build something for the long haul and you might try to make a significant amount of money with it. If you're just doing a side project or something, maybe that's a chance to do device-side receipt validation. But frankly, if you don't care about the money being made, I wouldn't even do receipt validation because most people don't hack, and the only people that can do that are jailbroken people. They probably aren't going to pay you anyway, so I wouldn't worry about it. Just skip that step, save yourself some time, and ship it. But if you are trying to build a big business, definitely validate your receipts. Okay, now I want to take you all on a journey through Jay Eiting's subscription server Inferno. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lay out what sort of levels of increasing complexity you're going to want to think about when you're building your subscription server. Because I've dealt with a lot of folks with different subscription setups. And there are certain dead ends that you want to avoid. And I'm going to try to lay out an order of operations. Oh, let me, there it is. Boom. Big 9 levels of hell. And progressively more frustrated emojis. But this is the order I think in which if you're trying to be agile about how you're building a subscription server, this is sort of the order that you want to do it in. I'm going to dive into each of these a little bit and kind of explain. So firstly, verification and persist. So verify is what I was mentioning with literally just taking that receipt, sending it to Apple, and having them return to you whether or not it's valid. That's really easy. You'll get an error code if it's invalid. You'll get an OK if you won't get an OK. You'll 200 on everything, but you can read the documentation, and there's a code that you can look for in the JSON. So the very, very simplest version would be just literally a relay, goes to your server, goes to Apple's server, back to your server, and then you just send that response down. There's only, you could contact Apple directly from your phone, but that's pretty easily cracked. Most StoreKit crackers will also swizzle out API calls to that endpoint. So don't do that. But that would be technically the most basic version, and you could even parse out that latest expiration date. But the second thing, and I pair this with this, is persist. And it's two things you want to persist. You want to persist the receipt file. So even if you're not using it, even if you don't need it, you don't know what you're going to do with it, save it. Put it in a database, stick it in an S3 container, attach it to some sort of personal identifier or some sort of ID for the user, because without that, that's one of these dead ends. If you don't save that receipt, in 6 months when your app's taking off and you're oh, I really want to know what my cohort retention is for the first month users or the monthly users, or I want to see how many people on annual have already unsubscribed. If you haven't done this, I'm sorry, nobody can help you. So do that at a minimum. The other thing you might want to persist to is like just that max expiration date, so that you send the thing off, you get your expiration date back, and then store that in a database somewhere, so you don't necessarily have to like fetch the receipt every time that somebody asks like, what's my expiration date? So those are the two, like the lightest. Like this is like the V1 or V0 of a subscription server. This is pretty easy. You can probably bang this out in like a couple hours or even less. Refreshing. So this is where it gets interesting. So as I mentioned, the verify receipt endpoint, that will give you new data. So as Apple charges your user again, as your user changes their renewal status, the response to that verify receipt callback is going to change. So you want to know when that changes. You want to know if somebody renewed so that when they log in again, you can just quick give them their expiration date. You don't have to necessarily verify the receipt again. But then the question becomes like, well, when do I actually refresh that receipt? I think a good rule of thumb is probably try to refresh all the receipts you have every day. That actually can scale pretally far. You need like over 100,000 receipts to not be able to refresh serially one receipt at a time in 24 hours. So that scales you to like a lot of revenue. At that point, you can pay somebody to come up with a fancier solution. But that's going to be really important for not so much the expiration dates, because like, well, let me give an example. So you don't need to do this if the only like touch point users have with your app is via the app. But if you have a website where you also are enabling content via this in-app subscription, you're definitely going to need to do this because the user might not open their app. They might not send you a new receipt from a new renewal transaction, so you won't know that they renewed unless you're checking it periodically. So that's one reason you would do that. Another reason is you just want to know like how many active subscribers do I have, and if you're not checking every day, that data is going to very quickly become out of date. Okay, so this one's a little more nuanced and doesn't have a solution necessarily, but it needs to be thought about, and that's identity. So, and this has gotten more complicated this week, I think, with sign-on with Apple, but I think most of the takeaways are still valid. Receipt files are going to be the same on multiple devices for the same user. So say a user has an iPhone and an iPad, they're sharing an iTunes account, those receipts are going to be the same. That's fine. Most of the time you want that content to be unlocked on both devices for users, but that can sometimes not play nice if you say if you have an account system or something and suddenly you just let the same receipt be used on n different accounts. Or let's say somebody's logged in with one account on one device, another account on a different device, maybe it's a family, but they share an iTunes account. What do you do if the same receipt gets sent to both? I don't have an answer. I think it's going to depend on your use case and sort of your business needs. But it's something you need to consider is like, do we let people essentially share receipts or not? My personal opinion is like, unless you have like a really thin margin you're trying to like eke out and you really can't let people share, or you have some sort of like downstream, like a deal with a content provider that doesn't let you do that, I would just let people share, because I've seen people try to be protective of this stuff, and often it just ends up cutting out legitimate use cases more than it protects from fraud. But that's my personal comfort level. It's really going to depend on your business and your use case. Well, okay, and so how do you actually deal with that? Like, how do I even know, for instance, that a receipt file belongs to the same user but same iTunes account? Fortunately, the transaction identifiers in there will be the same. So you'll be able to look and see like, this receipt that came from user A had this transaction ID, matches this other transaction ID, so we know this is actually the same user. And what you want to do, and we'll talk about schemas here in a second, but you want to make sure that you're not double counting that. So if you're relying on this data coming from your receipt for business info, for like active subscribers, churn, things like that, you want to make sure you're not counting each of those receipts as an active subscription, because they're actually the same subscription. And to make making that easier, you're really going to want to store transactions. So And what I mean by this is not just grabbing, up to this point I've just been talking about grabbing that max expiration date, which operationally really is the only thing you need, right? You just want to know, like, is this your subscriber or not? That's all I care about. But you very quickly want to know more. You want to know how many times has this person renewed? Did they upgrade? Did they downgrade? How many people do I have on this product? How many people do I have on that product? And the easiest way to do this is just to create a schema in your database where you like unroll all the transactions in that receipt and you store it in a table. It actually gives you a ton of functionality. If you just take the expires date, purchase date, all this stuff, put it in one big transactions table, it's going to unlock a ton of functionality. This is probably like the point what I would suggest like most people get to. This probably takes you, I don't know, like another week maybe to like get this all done. There's a lot of fields and stuff you have to just make sure you're parsing correctly. But this will get you a lot of business value. It'll let you do pretty much anything you want to do in the future. If you have an analyst come on, you can just like throw them this transaction table and they'll be able to figure things out mostly. Here's my super complicated SQL schema suggestion, which is that you have a receipts table and a transactions table. You want to make sure you're just tracking which receipts generated which transactions. And then you also want to make sure you're deduplicating. So that would be the case where like in the transactions table, you would make sure you had a unique key on the transaction identifier. But SQL databases are actually pretty good for this. If you're using like a NoSQL or something, God help you, I don't know. I'm just kidding. Pending renewal info. Okay, this is where it starts to get kind of fun. So transactions in the receipt, there's two big sections that really matter. There's there's transactions, which are things that have happened, money that has transacted or been canceled. The other big section is this section called pending renewal info. And it's this little unassuming looking JSON blob that actually contains a lot of really interesting stuff. And so they basically pack in an entry. You see it's an array, and then it's a bunch of dictionaries. You're going to get one of these for each active subscription because you can have like multiple active subscriptions in a single receipt at a time. And it tells you not what has happened, but what's going to happen. And that can be really useful for forecasting or saying how many of my subscribers have already opted out. So I'll just run down what's in these fields. So the top one, expiration intent. There's a lot of bad naming in StoreKit stuff. Expiration intent should really be called expiration reason because it tells you whether or not somebody unsubscribed on their own, they went into settings and unsubscribed, or their credit card expired, and whether it was a natural churn or sort of a voluntary churn or involuntary churn. Involuntary being they just were unsubscribed because their credit card expired and they didn't update it. And that can be really interesting. For some reason, somebody thought it was a great idea to use integers as strings as labels, which is fun. So you have to go look up Apple's stuff. I don't know why they didn't just call that involuntary or voluntary, but I don't have a radar for that, and I don't think they'll ever change it. But auto-renew product ID is really interesting. That'll tell you what they're going to renew to next. So let's say they're on your monthly right now. They upgrade to annual. Before that, sorry, it wouldn't work that way, go the other way. So let's say they're on annual and they want to downgrade to a month-to-month. The way that subscription groups work, that downgrade wouldn't happen until the end of their annual subscription. But before that, you would see it here. So you would see like, oh, that person downgraded to monthly. What kind of use cases? I don't know. You could send marketing info. It might just be useful to know like how many users are doing that. More likely, you're going to see it the other way around where somebody's like upgrading to a higher tier. Original transaction ID, that just helps you find the transaction it belongs to. Billing retry period will tell you if it's if Apple's like actively retrying it to like get that transaction to work. Product ID is just the product. This one's interesting, auto renew status. So as soon as somebody subscribes, that's gonna be 1, meaning I've just subscribed and I'm going to renew at the end of this period. As soon as somebody goes into settings and it says like, I don't want to renew, that's going to change to 0. And there's no other place to see that. That you won't get a notification in the app anywhere. But if you want to know if somebody opted out, you have to read this field. And then there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff you can do with that because you can say like, oh, send them a survey. You can send them a targeted offer to be like, hey, sorry to see you go. Like, if it was half as expensive, would you stay subscribed? Stuff like that. So that's really interesting. And this blob, or these pending renewal info, is one of the reasons why it's really useful to pull these receipts every day, because this stuff changes pretty fast. Like a user can go in and unsubscribe really quickly, technically. And it's good to know that. Okay, I'm gonna take another drink of water. Now we're getting into the hard stuff. Okay, prices. So this is probably one of the biggest pains if anybody's tried to do like analysis on subscriber bases, is that the Apple receipt does not, it tells you the product ID, but it doesn't tell you the price. So there's no way from the receipt to know, okay, yeah, they had a monthly, but how much is that actually worth to the business? And so you resort, most people I talk to that try to solve this problem, because you want to query, you want to say like, okay, in March, how much money did I make? You just select transactions from March, sum on price, and boom. But well, what's the price? So it's really easy if your app just has like monthly and annual. Monthly's $4.99, annual's $20 or something, great. But if anybody's done a subscription app over a period, it's like, well, then we try a different price, and then we want to try this and that, and pretty soon you have like 50 SKUs, and they all have different prices. And unless you're super woke on SKU names, like you probably didn't put the price in the SKU name or the tier in the SKU name. And so you end up having to encode them in your database and say like annual's worth this much, monthly's worth this much. That's fine. Alternatively, the way the RevenueCat SDK works, we just collect it from the client. So when somebody makes a purchase, they can see the price. So we actually send that up there. That's another way to like get that data into your system. But further complicating things is that prices are different in every country. So you not only need the receipt, you need to know what currency the receipt represents, or like what it was purchased with. And then you also need the price for that. Usually you can kind of figure things. You used to be able just to, if you knew the price tier, you could look at Apple's price tier calculations and figure it out, but they introduced localized pricing as well recently. So you really have to know, like at the time of purchase, what was the price for this product, so you can assign it to that. And then further complicating things, prices on products can change. So you need to either don't change your prices, which is what I recommend. If you have a price for a SKU, just leave it. If you want to change your price, just create a new SKU. That's going to be much easier. Rather than changing it, because your server is going to have to account for all of that. Prices, yeah. So I'm going to shout out to another radar here. My friend Jeffrey Grossman filed a really wonderful one explaining to the Apple team why having the price in the receipt would save thousands and thousands of developer hours every year. I would love to not have to think about this problem anymore. But I honestly don't know why they don't do it. Google does it in their API. Pretty much every payment API that's worth its weight is going to do it. But, you know, we're stuck with Apple. What are we going to do? So hopefully someday they decide to add it, but I'm not holding my breath. Server notifications. So this was introduced like 2 years ago, I think, or maybe 3. And the sale, and I remember watching the WWDC talk live, and people just like they got a standing ovation, I'm pretty sure, because everybody was like, finally, I don't need to do this refreshing crap, right? I can just rely on server. That's what everybody thinks, right? Server notifications. Oh, perfect, webhooks. I don't need to do this anymore. Turns out that was kind of oversold, because it doesn't actually get you out of refreshing receipts. So what's the point? And I actually still don't really know. It's useful, I guess, but they don't actually send you a notification when a renewal happens, which is most of the time that you want to know, right? That's the most common action, and they don't actually notify you when that happens. Understandably, I'm sure they have a crap ton of those events they would have to send out, and it would probably be a big infrastructure issue, but I don't know. It seems pretty poorly pulled off. I will go through like the caveats of the different types of notifications they do send. Initial buy. So one of the events, sorry, let me back up. Server notifications means you're going to go into App Store Connect and you're going to give Apple a URL, and then they're going to ping you when a bunch of different stuff happens with your subscriber base, right? And then they have like a certain number of event types that they send. The first one is initial buy. So anytime somebody starts a subscription, they're going to send you a receipt. That's great, but the problem is you have no idea who that receipt belongs to. It's not that interesting, frankly. Like, if I just gave you a receipt file of one of your users, like, what do you do with that? Like, it's just a blob that says, oh, somebody bought a monthly. Great. I can count them, I guess. I don't know. The next thing that they have is cancel, which is not actually cancel. It's actually a refund. So sorry, if you thought cancel meant cancel. It actually means refund. So this one throws everybody for a loop. You get an event. It says cancel. And you'll be like, oh, this person unsubscribed. Or worse is you'll implement this thinking that means that gets called when somebody unsubscribes. But no, it actually means they called Apple. They got a refund. Apple calls it a cancel. Inside the transaction fields in the receipt, cancellation date also maps to when somebody got a refund. So I guess it's internally consistent, but it's very confusing. Renewal. Oh, they did add renewal. Great. No, they didn't actually. It's actually not a renewal. This is really useful. So when somebody unsubscribes, when somebody has a billing error and their subscription stops, and then they fix their credit card and it renews, that's the method that they get sent. So I know everybody's just thinking, oh, all the things I can do with that, right? Yeah, so that's also very confusing because everybody saw this and was like, oh, great, they're doing renewals. I don't have to refresh receipts anymore, but no, you don't. Interactive renewal is like almost exactly the same as renewal, except for somebody went into iTunes and resubscribed, which is cool. These are actually kind of interesting. So did change renewal pref. This one's going to fire when somebody switches their renewal preference from monthly to annual or something else. And that's great because it typically happens in settings, which is really annoying. So somebody doesn't even have to open your app, and they can switch their subscription. So let's say you're some media company, you have an app and you have a website, and like Hulu's a good example where they have like multiple tiers of service. Somebody can go into settings and like switch from like Hulu to like Hulu Plus Pro with stars or whatever. If they didn't, previously to this, if they didn't open the app, you would just never know. That person would be getting charged, but you would have no way of knowing they did that. So this is how you would have to account for that. You'd have to have this webhook, because they might not open the app. I mean, they probably will, but they might not. And so you need to listen to this webhook. You need to then account for that so when they go on your website, they have access to the stuff they're paying for through iOS subscriptions. And then this one, which showed up in like half of the documentation in the past few months, and I've confirmed with people in the wild that it's actually getting called, will actually happen if somebody opts out. So previously they weren't even sending us a webhook when somebody opted out of a subscription. Now they are. So this is actually pretty interesting because you can technically kind of back off on the frequency of refreshing receipts maybe, because they're going to send you a notification that somebody switched off their trial or something. And that's really useful. Let's say you're doing marketing, you spend on a big Facebook campaign, you buy 1,000 users, and you want to see like how many of them have already opted out of your trial. That might give you some idea of the quality of that cohort. So yay, I was very excited they finally added that. You can read my very not snarky blog post about this. Sorry to all my friends on the StoreKit team. You know I love you. I'm just playing. I'm just fake mad. All these slides are going to be on my Twitter if anybody wants these links. Last thing, bells and whistles. So on top of all that, in the last 2 years, usually in March, Apple's been adding new features to subscriptions. I might suggest they spend some time fixing the current stuff, but you know, they gotta have stuff to put on the slides at the keynote. And the thing in 2018 they added was introductory prices and offers. So on top of all that stuff, price tracking, unrolling transactions and all that, they've now made more permutations of what a transaction can be. So previously, an introductory price, the only thing they had that was special was free trials. So either you paid full price right away, or you had a free trial for a certain period that then converted into a paid plan. Last year they introduced introductory prices, which lets you say, oh, it's $2.99 for the first, and you can pretty much do anything. You say like $2.99 for the first 2 weeks, then $6.99 a year after, or whatever. You can imagine any sort of permutation of that stuff. And that just adds sort of to your complexity about like, well, how do I track this in my system and stuff. So, but these are things that if you've built sort of all this stuff somewhat in the order I've specified, when you want to do introductory prices and offers, you should be able to pretty easily extend what you've done up to this point. The other thing that just launched like a month or two ago is subscription offers, which is really cool. So it's like sort of like how introductory prices work, except for you can offer at any point in somebody's subscription or past subscription, somebody who's lapsed, you can give them an offer. So you can say, oh, here, have a free month. It's really cool, but they've made it so that you need to actually set up a signing server and sign. Before you can grant somebody a subscription offer, you have to cryptographically sign the offer with your subscription key secret. So it's this whole new system. You're going to need another server endpoint, and you're going to have to like build that as well. But it does unlock some really cool stuff. I've been meaning to write about this, but one thing you can do that we previously had no capability of doing is I can give somebody a free month in the middle of their subscription, which unlocks some really cool stuff. Let's say I want to have a referral program. I want to give somebody a free month when they invite a friend. Previously, there was no way of doing that. Now you can. You can use subscription offers to extend their subscription by a month, and then without having them cancel. So the billing will just continue right after that. Subscription offers are great. You should try them. And then who knows? Nothing surprised us at DubDub this year. We'll see. It seems like next spring they'll probably add something new. I hope it's not too complicated. So that's it. We made it. We're at the core. We made it all the way down. How does that feel? You did it. Oh yeah, look, more blog posts. Surprise. These will be on my Twitter if you want the links. That's my Twitter. That's me with a better beard than I have now. If you want to see me get fake mad about this stuff 24/7, that's my Twitter handle. I'll be out in the hallway here if people want to talk about subscriptions, and a bunch of my friends are out there too who are really good at subscriptions too. Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.
We do have a we do have time for a few questions.
Oh, grill me. If anybody's got trivia, I want subscription trivia.
Okay. One. Back.
Oh, not that guy.
I'm sorry.
Hi, Jake.
Hi, Jacob. Thanks for a wonderful talk.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. So for the subscription offers where you can give a user a free month, is that month tacked on to the end of the year or at the end of the billing cycle, or can they expect not to be charged that month?
So like in the case that they have an annual subscription,
Yeah, and let's say you give
example,
them a free month. Does it just turn that into like a 13-month?
I believe it will go at the end of their current subscription. I would have to verify that though, because the way it works in Sandbox is not super trustworthy. I didn't even talk about Sandbox, by the way, which just basically like adds another layer of confusion to all this crap. But that would be something I have to test in Sandbox because I'm not actually sure what the behavior would be. But it works. Like by their specs, like it should work. So it's not a great answer. So.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Hand up if you have a question, please.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks, everybody.